Howdy, class. It is Thursday already. Wow. 11/12/20. How y'all doing? Did you get to watch those documentaries on Warhol yet or Basquiat? You better watch them. Gonna do a little quiz on them. In the meantime, today I want to continue with modern late 20th century artists, female artists that never have gotten their due in their day. Some of them did. Uh, the art world's been male dominated since the beginning of time, but there's been women artists supporting these males. Some of them were married to these guys. For example, Lee Krasner, uh, who was married to a very hard guy to be married to, Jackson Pollock, alcoholic, womanizer, suicidal, genius, perhaps, and his drip paintings. She had to go through a lot of emotional turmoil being married to him. It wasn't easy. No marriage is, but she was painting also at the same time. But of course, she's not getting the recognition. Why do I say of course? Because it was essentially women didn't think they had the critics, the public didn't think they had the angst, the desperation, the brilliance, the inspiration to actually do great art. Boy, were they wrong. She had a pretty good career aside from taking care of him, which she did, and she was painting all along. They had her studio together out in Long Island, and came into her own. And towards the end of her life, she died, relatively, mature, 74 years old. He died young in that drunken car crash in the 50s. She at least lived into the 80s, and of course controlled his estate, which was considerable, because his paintings now, well, none of them are really for sale. I don't think you can buy them. They're in museums. They're what you would call almost priceless, like the $200 or $300 million range. So that's pretty much what she did until her passing. But she was a strong woman. There's a really good movie starring Ed Harris um, called Pollock that he directed. Came out about 20 years ago, and you should watch it because it shows their relationship in a fictitious way, but pretty accurate. There's also documentaries on if you see documentaries on Willem de Kooning, her husband, you will see her kind of hovering in the background, always the second class citizen, but that's how it was. That's how it rolled. Another woman who became well known, abstract expressionist painter was Ellen de Kooning, who was married to Willem de Kooning. At the same time, he was becoming famous, the same time as Jackson Pollock did. And for his uh, his body of work, which was immense, but he had his loyal wife, who was an abstract expressionist also. And Elaine did good. She didn't outlive him. He lived uh, until the early 90s, and he finally died of Alzheimer's. But she made it to about 89 and only lived to 70. Uh, they both went to this thing called the New School, the New York School. It was a art school that a lot of famous artists came out of. They were teaching a different way of looking at art, not the traditional way of looking at art. It was more like looking at the world and painting what you feel, not necessarily what you see. Um, Once again, uh, Willem de Kooning was a major alcoholic. So was his wife, Ellen. Maybe you know people like that. Lots of couples tend to drink together, and she kept right up with him. And so there's a lot of emotional up and down in their life. But they did pretty good. They moved out. They made enough money to move out of Greenwich Village. Had a really nice setup, big studio setup out in Long Island, as did Jackson Pollock. Pollock, and if you've ever been to New York, hopefully you get out to Long Island. These areas now are so um, out of touch out of reach, I should say, for most regular people who just have to work for a living, not are wealthy and famous. That's where they lived. But when they went out there was very little out there. It was pretty rural. It was away from the city, so they wanted to get away from the noise and the traffic and the congestion to have some peace of mind to just paint. Uh, and maybe in a hope that it would curb the excesses. It sort of worked that way, but not really. Um, his Jackson was a driven man, driven to heights of extreme emotionalism. Now they would probably put him on Prozac. That's a fact. But they didn't have that in those days. Manic depression, which is bipolar now, extreme emotional up and down, peaks and valleys. A lot of times people controlled it or thought they were trying to control it through alcohol. Um, so these are two strong women painters on their own. They've each had exhibitions in museums on their own. Yes, I mean Lee Krasner doesn't have the same name as I bet everybody in the art world knows who she is. Whereas Elaine de Kooning does have the famous last name, and so does it make her art any less because it's in the shadow of her husband, who was a giant in the art world? You decide when you go look at the documentaries I'm going to ask you to look at, and maybe look at a sample of their work. You tell me. Um, Another really infamous, famous. I say infamous because she was known for more of her who she was married to. This next artist I'm going to talk about, and more of what she presented to the world. Not necessarily for her paintings because she didn't do that many, but the ones that she did stuck. And maybe you know her. Her name is Frida Kahlo. Maybe you've heard of that name. She was born in Mexico, and she was married early on to a giant of art painting in Mexico, Diego Rivera, who was known for his murals and his artwork, social commentary artwork, and these huge murals. This would be in the 1930s and 40s, and he became very wealthy. And she, at a very young age, was in a very horrific traffic accident, and actually, a from a construction site, the truck they crashed in a bus school, not a school bus, but a public bus crashed into a truck from a construction site. And like, you know what rebar is, folks? A piece of rebar punctured her like a spear, and it punctured her. I'm not exaggerating, folks. You're going to have to look it up. And I know what you're going to say when you read it. Ouch. The thing actually went through her whole body, and it came essentially out of her genitalia, and it pierced a lot of major organs, and it put her in a position of it made her handicapped. She still took out months and months to heal. She came out of it. She was never the same again. It never really totally healed. And she started making these very brutal um, self-portraits of her scar, of and she was very frank in talking to people about the accident. And people normally turn their eyes away from it because it punctured through her vagina walls, folks. And so nobody wanted to say those words or think of that. And so her accent was horrific. And physically, she was never the same again. It messed with her for the rest of her life. She drank a lot, got a lot of drugs, and then started painting these very incisive self portraits that really took off in the modern art world. And her husband, who was famous, um, would go to New York City and uh, allowed, and that put her out into the social world, and people are mesmerized by her. She would wear traditional Mexican antique sort of dressing. She didn't dress modern, and so she really stuck out. Maybe you've seen self portraits of her. Maybe seen her drawings. I hope you have. There's a ton of material about her out there in the world, from calendars to cards to lots of art books. Uh, I'm going to ask you to. I'll have to find a documentary about her and then take a look at it. Tell me what you think, because she's was a brilliant, strong, early feminist woman who had, believe it or not, even though she was freakishly mangled in this accident, she had lots of sexual partners, folks, male and female, and her and Diego were on and off just divorcing, but they're always he was 20 years older than her, and she came into her own, very much so. But this horrific accident made her not give up, made her stronger. If you know anything about punk rock music, that came out in the 70s in New York and London and LA, San Francisco, they love Frida Kahlo because it present as an artist and as inspiration, because she inspired people to look away from the tragedies that strike a lot of us and don't let it stop them. Punk music and the punk attitude was all DIY, do it yourself. She had that same attitude. Do not depend on others. Do it yourself. And it really struck a chord as a feminist icon and a woman working her way through the modern world. She didn't live very long. She died in the early 50s. Believe it or not, she died of her, essentially, she died of her wounds, even though she lived with them for many, many, many years. Spent a lot of time in bed in excruciating pain, wearing all sorts of devices to keep her upright, to keep her moving forward. It was a nonstop 20 years of pain, excruciating pain, folks, that she lived with. And she was really brilliant phenomenon, and broke all the rules. For somebody who coming from a repressed culture like Mexico at the time, very religious culture, women were supposed to follow, just be subservient to the men. She blew all that out of the water. So that's another famous female who climbed the Mount Everest of adversity to still claw her way to show the world one thing: this is who I am. And that's not easy, folks. Think about it. Do you show the world who you are exactly? Your employers, your friends, school, whatever it is you do. Um, you know, many of us don't. Uh, and it's a struggle for some people, not everybody. Anyway, it wasn't a struggle with her. We still look up to her and still read incredible things about her to this day, and she's been dead for 60 some years. The another painter I want to talk about, Georgia O'Keeffe, um, lived a ripe old age. Well into her 90s, 98, died in about 90, late 90s, some along there. Georgia O'Keeffe was as best famous as an artist, female or male, you could possibly get in this world we live in. Her stuff still is iconic and still brings in major dollars at auctions. Um, she once again was a feminist because she was married. That there's always been rumor that she was gay, but she was married like a lot of people were in those days. And so her gay life was hidden in the closet. Um, she was married to a famous photographer who took a lot of famous photos of her. You can see all this stuff online and in documentaries, etc. Um, she had a very severe look. She looked like a school teacher who was always pissed off at something. She wasn't. I don't think I've ever seen a picture of her smiling. She's very stoic, and she had painted pretty incredible works early on in her career, but she didn't get the notice that finally came to her until she moved out to New Mexico. And maybe you've seen her work, the flowers, the cactus, the landscapes mostly that had become iconic that are in our they're as iconic as Warhol's tomato soup cans. Um, because they've put them on calendars now. They've commercialized the heck out of it to where it's hard even to see if it's great art anymore because they're on calendars, they're on Hallmark cards, they're on cute kitsch um, in a way that I think takes away from the um, the beauty of the art when they make it over commercial. But if you ever get out to Santa Fe, New Mexico, I suggest you do. There's the George O'Keeffe Museum. They dedicated an entire museum there. It's a really pretty good museum. When I lived out there, I went to it several times. You can watch a documentary. It's a ton of her artworks in there, the history of who she is, and it's really well tended. Not now, of course, during the pandemic, everything's kind of shut down and on hold. But the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum will give you for a fee. I don't know what it is, 18, $20. You'll go in there, spend the whole day in there, and become immersed in the Georgia O'Keeffe Southwest. Um, she lived in a ranch called Ghost Ranch outside of town, quite a ways actually, and she did most of her work there. Um, became later on that ranch was bought by the filmmaker, actor, director Dennis Hopper, and he lived out there for years. So it's famous for people who wanted to escape the hubbub of noisy New York life or LA life or San Francisco life or LA life and still be inspired. And the New Mexico landscape inspired Georgia O'Keeffe like a house on fire. Uh, Other people have gone out there looking for the same thing. Um, uh, forgetting his name right now, but the novelist who wrote Women of Love, he went out there for the same way. He lived up in Taos, and he's a British. I can't think of his name. Anyway, I'll come up with a second. Anyway, and as my personal story, I went out to Santa Fe in 1989 because I'd been reading about this arts community, and it wasn't happening for me in LA. I was getting tired of it, struggling to be a filmmaker, writer. There's so many people you're in competition with. It's a beauty pageant also, and as you well could see, I didn't pass that. But I'd read about this art community up in the mountains of 7,000 feet up in New Mexico. And it appealed to me and my girlfriend at the time. He was an actor. And so we went out there. We moved out there in 1989. And because of the writers and performers like Dennis Hopper and Georgia O'Keeffe and it's drugging me. I can't think of his name. Lawrence. Jeez, he's very famous too, folks. I'm not kidding. I'm going to look it up real quick, and because it's infuriating that I can't think of it. Really weird. Anyway, hang on a sec. Just have some patience. You're not going anywhere. You don't have anything to do besides this. Yeah, D.H. Lawrence. Jeez, ridiculous. He wrote some novels in the early part of the 20th century that were considered very risque. Sons and Lovers and Women in Love, where he described the sexual act in an erotic way that was censored in different areas of the world. They made a brilliant movie. Ken Russell directed it in the 1960s, Women in Love, with Glenda Jackson and Oliver Reed and the rest. He was living out there. So there was a movement to like embrace the wide open spaces of New Mexico, and it's high desert, 7,000 feet. So it's not like the low desert, say Phoenix area, where it's hot. High desert is never that hot, but it is barren because it doesn't rain much. But it's a beautiful landscape. It inspires you. It inspired me. I wrote many plays out there. I got the chance to direct a couple of movies. I was in a rock band. It was pretty inspiring environment. And it still is. I still go out there twice a year and intend on retiring there one day, possibly. We'll see. Anyway, plus the weather's nice. Yeah, it's a high desert, but it's at 7,000 feet. The high will be 85 degrees. It does get cold, and it does snow, folks, even though it's a high desert. Anyway, so Georgia O'Keeffe put Santa Fe on the map that way. Now, a lot of people, it bothers people because it's brought a lot of people out there, from California and Texas, and the fans, which there's not very many of them, don't like. I don't blame them, but that's how the world moves. People move in and out of places. You can't stop them from doing that. Anyway, Georgia O'Keeffe, check her out. I'll find some documentaries. You guys look at it. I'll post those on Canvas, along with this lecture, obviously. One other woman I want to talk about briefly is a Japanese artist who's still alive, by the way. All these other people are dead. She's old, though. She's born in 29, so I mean she's 91. And she is Yoi Kazuma. Hopefully I'm not butchering that name too bad. She is a film actor. She's actually been in films. One of her most famous ones is called Tokyo Decadence. She is an installation artist, not a painter so much. And these are all painters I've been talking about. She installs installations. Do you know what that means? Well, you have to, they're almost like miniature little theatrical pieces or film that is in a gallery. And it could be small, it could be huge, it could take up a whole room. And her stuff is usually pretty big, it takes up a lot of space. It's a lot of work involved, a lot of creative detail involved. And it's not, you have to have a large space to display your work in. and her stuff is usually has a social commentary aspect about the culture she's living in. She's also it's considered pop art because there is some aspect of pop commercial what I should say is consumerism in her art. She's commenting on it. Uh, Minimalism because sometimes it's very simplistic, small in not necessarily in size, but in the way it's presented. Uh, Minimal could be a lot of different things. Um, it could stand for a lot of different things. We should talk about that later. What is minimalism? But it's doing a lot with a little by showing, depicting a little. I'm not saying with a little few supply. There's a lot of guys who did this. They could have one color on the canvas, a red canvas. That's it, folks. That's pretty minimal. But when you look at the red canvas, you see something. Maybe it's there, maybe it isn't. Or there'll be a line going through a black canvas or a white canvas. You feel something. It quiets the noise of the world and it makes you flourish in that quiet. And so her installations could be like that. I hope I'm giving it justice describing it like that. That it's being displayed in. Also, and it's also been described as feminist art because it definitely has a feminist angle to it. And before you guys and girls get a woman who wants to be taken seriously on class citizen that supports the male. Not so much anymore, but that's money. Movie stars is the same way. Nicole Kidman, always. Yeah, they're married. I shouldn't say that they were married together. She is a better actor. That's in my opinion. I think Tom needs to stop making Mission Impossible. 58 years old. Well, then seek out some art. Why don't you do some art? Go get some throw on a canvas. Make a mess. Come on. An expression